Welcome, everyone. My name's Lisa Brown. I'm the Executive Director of ACS, and we're thrilled to have all of you here tonight. It's a particular personal honor for me to have ACS sponsoring tonight's program. These are two men for whom I have such profound respect, and I grew up with a dad who was absolutely passionate about our constitutional rights, and there were dinner table conversations about freedom and equality and how lucky we were to grow up in this country, which at age 10 you don't always fully appreciate, but did over time absolutely set the standard for what I wanted to do with my life. And I heard from him his personal experience in walking on the March on Washington. And I don't know how many lawyers are in the room this evening, but I know I'm not alone in saying that it was the civil rights movement that inspired me to go to law school, and that made me want to always use those skills that I had learned in law school to somehow better my community. And at least for me, part of what the civil rights movement taught us was not just the power of a collective movement to do what is right, but also the power of our Constitution, the rule of law, and lawyers in that quest. And I ended up clerking on the 11th Circuit in Montgomery, Alabama, because of my interest in the civil rights movement. And at the time, I remember reading voraciously everything that I could get my hands on about the civil rights movement and its leaders and the judges that were actually trying to give meaning to our constitutional guarantees. Unfortunately, it was 2 years before Parting the Waters came out, so I had to read 25 books instead of being able to have just read one, which would have taught me all that I needed to know at the time. And we have a wonderful opportunity this evening to hear from two men who not only were very influential in the civil rights movement, but both of whom have written about it. And I think in many ways part of ACS's mission is to keep this very fight alive, to make sure that we keep working for liberty, equality, and justice for all in the face of new challenges and when we see new opportunities. We really want to work with all of you to address the issues of our day, to think creatively about new ideas for addressing those issues, and then to go back to our communities and convince our communities that those ideas are going to lead to a better future. Neither of tonight's speakers needs any introduction, but my job, nonetheless, is to introduce my dear friend and ACS board member, Roger Wilkins. Roger has a long history of advocating for equality and justice, and I cannot begin to itemize all that he has done for our country or individuals in it. To say that Roger is a lawyer, a journalist, and a historian doesn't begin to tell the story, so I'll just do a couple of quick highlights. As a lawyer, Roger interned with Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He was a caseworker in the Ohio Welfare Department, worked for the U.S. Agency of International Development, and then served as Assistant Attorney General under President Johnson, the first African American to achieve that rank. And he still is on the board of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund today, I believe. As a journalist, he was a similar underachiever, and he joined the editorial staff of the Washington Post, where along with Carl Bernstein, Herb Block, and Bob Woodward shared a Pulitzer Prize for their exposing the Watergate scandal. He then went on to the New York Times, where he served as the first African American on its editorial board, as well as a columnist. And something I hadn't known before this evening, actually did a brief stint at the now defunct Washington Star, for those of you who are Washingtonians, a paper that I read in my youth, as well as working for NPR and CBS Radio. And then as a historian and writer, Roger is the author of several award-winning books, including A Man's Life, Quiet Riots, which he co-authored with Fred Harris, and Jefferson's Pillow, The Founding Fathers and the Dilemma of Black Patriotism. Roger's also the publisher of the NAACP's journal, Crisis. He's now a professor of history and American culture at George Mason University and continues to be a very, very highly regarded commentator and analyst of social justice and public policy issues. If you don't know Roger Wilkins, you should. I had not had the pleasure of working with him prior to joining ACS, and I have to say quite simply that it was the best unadvertised job benefit that came along with my job. I've never spent time with him without regretting that that time had to come to an end, and I only wish I had half his intelligence, thoughtfulness, honesty, passion, humor, and grace. Roger.
Thank you, Lisa. That was terrific. And Taylor, after that introduction, you can go home now. I want to talk to you first about ACS as a board member from, at least from my perspective. Others may have different perspectives. But we are people who believe that the Constitution counts, that we are people who believe that the Constitution of the United States is the central element in our governing structure. We're people who believe that the provisions of the Constitution are in force at all times, especially those which guarantee us privacy and autonomy and the freedom from governmental intimidation as we practice politics. We believe that, in one respect, the original intent of the framers is immutable. And that original intent was stated not by any of the lawyers, Jefferson or Mason or any of the others, but by Benjamin Franklin, who at the end of the Constitutional Convention, when 55 American politicians had done something that no 55 American politicians have done since, that is, they kept a secret for about 3 months. So when they emerged from the Constitutional Convention, having agreed on it, a woman approached Franklin on the streets of Philadelphia and said, "What have you made for us in there, Dr. Franklin?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." We are people who believe that the Constitution and its prescriptions for our freedom and for robust, full political debate has to be fought for fiercely in every generation. That, we believe, is the original intent. Now, we're really quite young, right? 4 years old? 4 years old this summer. We have 142 student chapters, 21 lawyer chapters. We have a major program, the Constitution in the 21st Century Project, and we have issue groups that are hosting conferences and publishing papers on a variety of issues: separation of powers and federalism, access to justice, constitutional interpretation and change, liberty and equality, democracy and voting, criminal justice. And we published papers on Judge Alito's nomination to the Supreme Court and managed to knock down some misinformation which was circulated about Justice Ginsburg's confirmation process. Well, we've done a lot of other stuff, but that's enough to give you a sense that this is an energetic, growing, fruitful process and organization that is determined to carry out Benjamin Franklin's charge. He meant for us to be as active in our lives in the defense of the Constitution as the founding generation was in creating for us the benefits of this free society. So for that concludes my discussion about the American Constitution Society. And since I said that Taylor could go home, I don't have to introduce him, and we can go directly to the wine. Now, this is really a delight to introduce to you my friend Taylor Branch. Now, I know that Taylor has published 10 books. Now, for a guy who thinks of himself as a writer who kind of can get out a book every decade and a half, somebody's written 10 books, is astonishing, or perhaps insane, or perhaps both. But I asked him, I said, Taylor, did you ever work before you started writing those books? And he said, yeah. I was an editor at the Washington Monthly, at Harper's, Esquire. And he is an astounding man. He has written this incredible trilogy on the life and the times of Martin Luther King, Jr., which even if you lived through it, even if you knew most of the characters in the book, even if you had participated in some of the activities described in the book, Taylor renders it with such freshness, such insight, and such kind of a narrative power that it's like reading a great work of fiction. You don't want to put it down. It's too good. It's too incisive. It's teaching you too much. Two other things about Taylor. His middle book, Pillar of Fire, won the Pulitzer Prize. And the last thing I'll say about Taylor is this. I was talking to his and my dear mutual friend Julian Bond recently, and we were talking about, got around to talking about Taylor. And so Julian said something it was unlike anything he said. I've known Julian for 40 years. It's unlike anything he's ever said to me before. He said, you know, Taylor is a good Christian man. Well, I don't quite know what that means because I haven't seen the Da Vinci Code yet, but it was meant as a deep expression of affection and respect. And Julian doesn't throw that kind of stuff around easily. So, Taylor, it's a delight to have you.
Hello, I am very happy to be here. Please forgive me for being late. The traffic was awful. I won't say any more on that subject and try to make it up by being succinct. I was delighted when Roger invited me here for two reasons. First of all, that he had called me and we got a chance to talk. Second of all, I was delighted to learn that an organization like this exists, which I didn't know. I think that it springs from urgent needs in the body politic. It is a wonderful notion to have people enthralled with all of the ideas involved with law and the Constitution and freedom. We are sorely out of touch with our times in many respects, and I want to try to throw out some provocative ideas in that regard that I think may or may not engage your mission, because I think your mission is very timely and quite urgent, in part because I think we are out of phase with our own history and with our own intellectual traditions, which could present us with a crisis. I think it does present us with a crisis, but I think at the same time it presents us with enormous opportunities. The sort of government that Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it, remains an enormous challenge to most of the world to this day. The very form of government, a constitutional democratic republic, is preposterous to most of the people who have ever drawn breath on this globe, who believe people need a force of external authority to tell them what to do, and that people are more like children. There's still lots and lots of people around the world who believe that to this day, including some in the United States who do it in a closet sort of way. But the kind of government that was prescribed was a challenge to every fiber of the people who were in the room making it. They fought, they screamed, they threatened one another. They threatened one another with war in the midst of the Constitutional Convention. But they came up with and engaged a new form of government that is as deep as religion, as broad as philosophy, and as enthralling and transformative as music, all at once. It remains so to this day, but we take it for granted, and we've reduced it to a little package in our pocket, or a little USA on our shirts, and we've drained all of the excitement and the challenge out of an enormously rich but fraught political idea. There's nobody on the face of the earth today contending for a different form of political organization in the world. There's an enormous weight on representative democracy, but we don't act like it. We need to be reminded that only a century ago, the Pope issued an encyclical that basically called democracy a heresy against the ancient doctrinal stability of the doctrines of one God, one Pope, one King. And only a few years after that, when King Edward died, they had a funeral over in London. Teddy Roosevelt was there representing the United States, and they made him march way, way at the rear among what were known as the Republican representatives who lacked royal blood. That's less than a century ago, before World War I. The world was canopied with czars and sultans and dowagers and emperors and kings. And democracy was considered so frail that two huge forms of totalitarian government, communism and Nazism, rose up saying, you know, if the monarchs are going to fall, something with some guts and discipline's got to come in and run the world. Democracy's a joke. Think what democracy did just in the intellectual realm. I'm just trying to say a few things about how novel this form of government still is. But in one sense, just in an intellectual, philosophical sense, the way I like to think about it is that basically all previous political theory in the history of the world was vertical. It was about relationships up and down the chain of command and sovereignty. What was sovereignty? The kings, the nobles, the serfs, liege lords, obligations, responsibilities up and down in a vertical system that fit with the great chain of being that the Pope was emphasizing, all the way from God down to the worms, with us somewhere in the middle but very exalted. The American Revolution turned political theory horizontal for the first time. When they were threatening one another there in Philadelphia, they were threatening one another along horizontal lines between the big states and the little states, and the slave states and the non-slave states, over what kind of compact they could knit together in a vote-based system, not a sovereign-based, authority-based system, but a vote-based system. Now, almost 200 years ago, after that, the Civil Rights Movement comes along saying the promise is in that system. And the vote, of course, the atomic particle of representative democracy, is nothing to Dr. King but a piece of nonviolence. That's all a vote is. It's that way to us today, but we never talk about it. We all want people to vote in Iraq, but nobody talks about the surpassing mystery why some grizzled insurgent with a belt full of rocket-propelled grenades should care that women and old men are dropping pieces of paper in a ballot box for the first time. And that's power, not the rocket-propelled grenades. This is the kind of idea that the Civil Rights Movement embraced, that nonviolence is at the heart of democracy. That's what it is. That's what the politics is. That's one of the things that made the Founding Fathers revolutionary. They were trying to design a system built on votes, not built on liege lords backed up by the king's army and loyalty oaths and whatever else you had had in politics. Nonviolence also connected emotionally and psychologically with the most revolutionary attitudes in the democratic revolution heritage from America. Self-government, the notion that people can govern themselves, as epitomized by Madison arguing for the ratification of the Constitution, summoning every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government, that people can govern themselves, that a citizens' compact can have discipline in the world, individually and collectively. The very revolutionary notion. Without that, you can't succeed. It challenges our conservative notion. It challenges the deficit. It challenges the belief that whether or not we can live on this planet without consuming it, whether or not we can be self-governing is an enormous and perpetual challenge to people living on the face of this earth. But at the same time, he said, and in a sense, that's calling for discipline in a constitutional democratic system. But he also said you have to have faith. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. No form of government can secure liberty, said Madison, without virtue in the people. You have to have public trust, accountable public trust. Govern yourselves and have accountable public trust. That's upside down to everybody else who ever wrote about politics. Govern other people and trust yourself. Madison is saying govern yourselves collectively and individually and build public trust through the constitutional system. And all I want to say on this, because I'm trying to speak in shorthand, is that that is epitomized in the revolutionary attitudes of people in the civil rights movement. Nobody is more self-governing than a freedom rider, saying you can hit me in the head, you can kill me, but it won't stop freedom, and it won't stop me from believing that you and I can form a new civic bond, even if you hate me, even if you're Bull Connor, even if you're a Klansman. Nobody epitomized self-government, self-discipline, and public trust and civic faith more than somebody in the nonviolent civil rights movement, which is why the civil rights movement magnificently advanced constitutional freedom in its time, and why the great mystery of today is, why is that not the model for how we foster, improve, refine democracy in the world? Why we're stuck on the Vietnam model. Nobody thinks of the civil rights movement as the model for how to create new democracy, not just to lift terrorism from the South, from Southern black people, but to lift poverty from Southern white people, to lift the stigma of segregation from Southern politicians who could never dream of being Senate Majority Leader or Speaker of the House when it was segregated. They were all marginalized until the civil rights movement came along and lifted all those burdens. The South wasn't even fit for professional sports. Ivan Allen, the mayor of Atlanta, said as soon as the Civil Rights Bill passed, we built a stadium on land we didn't own with money we didn't have for a team we hadn't found. And within 6 months, they got the Milwaukee Braves to move to Atlanta and become the Atlanta Braves, the first Major League Baseball team in the South. Couldn't exist when it was segregated. You couldn't even have corporate meetings in the South. So much of its psychic and economic energy was invested in crippling its soul to segregate a third of its citizens. But when the civil rights movement inspired the country through constitutional means to lift the burden of segregation by a nonviolent shock troops, the benefits spread far and wide. Not just to white people in the South, not just to black people in the South, not just to the political health of our system, switching from an ossified one-party white supremacist system which we had in the South now to at least the beginnings of two-party competition there. And of course what's new in the South is the party that's trying to run coalitions, biracial, triracial, all kinds of coalitions. What's constant in the South is that there's a party of presumed white males that gets 70% plus of the white male vote. They've switched names, but that's the constant. What's new is that you have a bipartisan hope for the future of creating a two-party system. So the question I want to leave with you is why is the civil rights movement not more of a model for how we refine democracy? And I think that is a great intellectual challenge. It has frustrated me a little bit coming out with this third book. My books take so long that whenever they come out, I hibernate for 8 years, then I get shot out of a cannon and go around and try to test the public market for, sense for what things are like. When Parting the Waters came out 18 years ago, there was a tremendous nostalgia for the 1960s. That's gone. I think there's a great sense of crisis today, to some degree a sense of resignation, or at least people talk about that, the people interviewing me. And I was asked by an interviewer on TV, who is J. Edgar Hoover? So things have changed, but I don't sense any longer an engagement with the 1960s, and I don't blame people for this. I think people tend to see this as a time that was wonderful and inspiring, but limited to quaint and archaic practices having to do with black folks. And it's limited and packaged as something of, for, by, and about black folks, which it was, but it was more than that. And it would have never been the success it was if the civil rights movement had framed the struggle only in racial terms. Dr. King framed it, and the reason the movement made him, he didn't make the movement, but the reason that we remember him so well is because he framed the struggle against segregation in such large, patriotic, constitutional terms, saying that we are trying to redeem the soul of America. We are trying to save freedom and democracy in the world. That's why his words resonated around the world. The spirit of the civil rights movement has been alive much more outside the United States than it has in the United States, in spite of our own example. They were singing "We Shall Overcome" when the Berlin Wall fell. They were singing it in Prague. They were singing it in South Africa. They were even singing it in Tiananmen Square, where they've had rebellions for 5,000 years, but never one model before on a sit-in that has planted. It didn't win, but it hadn't been forgotten either. And it planted seeds of freedom in the shell of that authoritarian system. But what I want to challenge you with is, I think there's tremendous inspiration and intellectual mystery coming out of the civil rights period. All of the benefits that flowed. I also want to mention females. I was really surprised in doing this last book to find that many states did not allow women of any race to serve on juries during the civil rights movement. Has anybody studied White v. Crook? The case in 1966 filed by a number of lawyers, including my heroine, Pauli Murray, that overturned the Alabama law that flatly banned women from serving on any kind of jury, a grand jury, a petty jury, civil jury, any kind of jury. 1966. And many, many other states were like that. All these things fell, and we have a hard time connecting with how hierarchical our world was back then. We take for granted the benefits that have flowed out of the movement. In historical terms, we have moved light years forward in the spirit of the civil rights movement on the ground empirically, but we have at the same time created a mythology that this era was an era of failure when government went off the rails, when we fought a war against poverty and poverty won, when public service proved that it was overreaching and overbearing, when people showed no discipline. It was a time of license. We have all these myths. In a way, we're doing a pale imitation of the mythology that occurred 100 years ago after the Civil War and Reconstruction, in which we said not that Reconstruction was an experiment in new democracy and new public schools and interracial political cooperation as envisioned and guaranteed by the amendments to the Constitution, but that it was a time of unbridled license by black people running roughshod over the suffering white planters until the Ku Klux Klan rescued them, redeemed them. That's the religious word. Terror and violence throttled democracy a century ago, and we created a mythology among white people, basically north and south, that this was a good thing in the interest of orderly government so that we wouldn't have to fight over race anymore. It helped create the progressive era, but it poisoned and imprisoned our minds. And we're doing the same thing now about the 1960s. Public service was very, very high. When I went to Princeton in graduate school in the late 1960s, 40-something% of the graduate students out of the Woodrow Wilson School went into public service. The family that gave the money for that is now suing Princeton to get the money back because nobody is going into public service today. Nobody. They abolished the Public Service Award at Princeton. It's not there anymore. People, and of course when I was there, they had the first female undergraduates arrived. They were, now of course the undergraduates at Princeton barely tolerated the graduate students like me, but I had a honeymoon compared to what those first female undergraduates had. It was nasty. It was mean. It wasn't, and that's why Judge Alito could barely remember that he was on a committee that opposed it. Why? Because he was on the wrong side of history. Consistently on the wrong side of history. And that's the mythology that kind of entraps us. We live in a world that is still being reformed by Martin Luther King's movement. Constitutional, spiritual quest that engaged every fiber of their minds, their bodies, their spirits, and is still sowing blessings in our world. And yet we are enthralled to the language of political reaction. So we are in a period of great disconnect. The Federalist Society is a perfect example of it. I hope it's your bête noire. It has a symbol. Its symbol is James Madison, who went to the Constitutional Convention with a draft saying that he wanted the federal government to have a veto on every single state law that was passed. That was his model. They think of him as somebody who wanted to dismantle the federal government unless it had to do with the military. They don't even understand. We have a really fundamental disconnect about our own heritage. And it seems to me that there are open fields for honest scholarship, for honest legal work, for honest political agitation, all the way from corporate governance. How do you govern a corporation in the spirit of the Constitution and equal citizenship? All across the line, the environment, the economy, race relations, matters of justice, abortion. Don't shy away from the hard subjects. That's when we lost ground. The movement tackled the hardest subjects, the ones that everybody was scared of, black and white. Scared to get in that line, scared to go in that jail, with good reason. Tackling the hard questions. So there are lots of different things to say about this. But the main thing that I'd like to leave with you is a historian sense that we are out of phase historically with our own example. And a movement person's, somebody studying the movement. I wasn't a movement person. I was just on the tail end of it. I ironed Julian Bond's shirts in 1968 at the Chicago Convention when we had a challenge delegation from Georgia. I was 21. Julian was chairman of the, but even he was so young that when they tried to nominate him for vice president, some of you may remember, he had to drop out because he wasn't old enough under the Constitution. And we all acceded to that. I'm not a movement person, but I am enough of a student of it after 24 years, living and breathing and permanently entranced by everything going on in the movement, to assert to you, to urge you to see the civil rights movement as a model for engagement with the most basic and deepest issues of law and freedom in American society. They were modern founders. They did just what the founding fathers did. They confronted systems of hierarchy and subjugation and figured out ways to create new forms of common citizenship. That's what it's about. We think of it as a black movement because the rights most abridged were the rights of black people. But civil rights means rights pertaining to a citizen. And citizen in a democratic republic is an elevated form of political discourse. It means we're all responsible for what goes on. It means the government can't do anything except what we let them do. It means that the bumper stickers saying "not in my name" are a cop-out. It is in our name what happens, and we are responsible for it, and we need to get out there and do something about it. I dedicated part of this last book to Diane Nash, in part, who was a Chicago woman, leader of the Freedom Rides, Nashville SNCC leader, notable for many things, including writing on the night of the Birmingham church bombing, September of 1963, the blueprint before morning for what became the Selma voting rights movement early in 1965. She did it as a citizen who was not allowed to vote in Alabama herself. But it's a model of her whole, and the movement's whole approach. It didn't occur to her to write a screed against who did the Birmingham church bombing, to protest against the president for being inert. President Kennedy sent a football coach to calm, Earl Blake, the West Point football coach, to calm Birmingham down. There was no pretense of justice there. She didn't write a summons to people to be angry and organize to elect a new president or a new government or to have a revolution or whatever. She said it was up to her to have a plan to answer this by morning. Years later, in one of my interviews, I was asking her about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and something that they had done to her, because the FBI didn't harass just Martin Luther King. They harassed a lot of people. And she said, "Don't talk to me about Hoover. Hoover is our fault." I said, "What do you mean Hoover is your fault? You didn't have anything to do with Hoover, and he's doing all these terrible things." He said, "Yes, but we left him in a position of arbitrary authority for 50 years, and we got exactly what we deserved. You only have to study about 2 weeks of elementary civics to know that in the system that we designed, you shouldn't have something like that." Hoover was a bad example of what it was, but he was the citizens' fault. And the movement taught us that if we really do believe that we live in a country where we have the same vote that the president has, and we have equal souls and equal votes, in the sense that all of our votes are counted the same, then it's up to us not to allow J. Edgar Hoover to be there. That sense of citizenship should be widespread everywhere. It should animate every lawyer, because lawyers, I think, tend to have a notion of special citizenship, but it should be devoted to elevating everybody's sense of citizenship to engage in this remarkable experiment, this remarkable system that we have. But my view is that we have to have ideas in our heads and an understanding of history that will expand, that will be realistic, that will engage reality, but will expand our sense of citizenship in the world. Finally, let me say just one thing. The most remarkable aspect about Martin Luther King, to my mind, in all this time, is that he spoke about religion and politics every day, often 5-6 speeches a day. He knew he had many enemies, that he had people trying to kill him. He knew that his own government that was supporting him was wiretapping him. He knew that a number of his most influential supporters were very patronizing toward him. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post told him that he couldn't talk about foreign policy because he should stick to civil rights and race relations. He would have been mistaken for a waiter in any public street corner if there weren't a lot of newspaper people there right until the end of his life. He knew all of these things about how marginalized he was. And his own aides were pulling him apart in various different directions. But he talked about American democracy and freedom, equal souls, equal votes, all the time anyway, in a very political, spiritual, prophetic way, and not once can I find on the public record any of his critics or enemies attacking him for mixing church and state. That in itself is a remarkable fact. How can Martin Luther King never be attacked for mixing church and state? Because it's not necessary if you love the Constitution enough and you love religion enough to see the common sources that don't threaten one with the other. It's because he wasn't trying to subdue politics with religion, and he wasn't trying to drive religion out of politics, which is what most people do when they mix the two. He understood that there are common inspirations and common ideas at the bottom of religion and at the bottom of democratic theory that unite America, that make our only story freedom, and allowed him to say, to appeal to the nation to rise up and live out the true meaning of our creed. The whole movement was an appeal to the American citizenry to refine freedom through the government. That didn't mean that he didn't know the faults of the government and how cruel the government could be. That didn't mean that at all. The reason that his voice has such resonance is that he knew those realities. He knew how cruel the world was. And in the wood stove of his voice, he thought there was enough inspiration in our history and in our spirit to confront even those realities. And if he could summon that kind of hope in a period of lynchings and segregation, then we need to be able to do the same here and not allow ourselves to be stuck in the backwater of history and mythology during which the prevailing political idea in elections during the lifetime of anybody who's a law student now is that government is bad. That's what wins elections, but it's not what determines America's freedom in the long run. So I hope that you as lawyers and people who care about the Constitution and freedom can study the civil rights movement, can adopt it as a model for how we go about rescuing our form of government. The movement said one thing: the best way to preserve and foster democracy is to love it, to study it, but above all, to practice it. Thank you.
We're going to have a little conversation now, and mostly between Roger and Taylor. I'm here mostly to be traffic cop, and then we're going to open it up to you and let you ask some questions. But since I am the traffic cop, I get to grab the first question. And I was intrigued by your notion that we should grab the civil rights movement and use it as a model for resolving other kinds of problems, other dilemmas that we have. And in recent weeks, the country has been obsessed with immigration. And many have commented that seeing people go out into the streets to demonstrate is sort of the mark of a beginning of a new Latino civil rights movement. And I wonder what your thoughts were on that. Is that sort of the civil rights movement approach that you're talking about, or is that something very different?
Well, I think anytime you have people agitating over what it means to be a citizen and what their rights and goals and aspirations are, and the civil rights movement was filled with argumentation about unmet rights and yearnings to be free against allegations that you're breaking the law. I mean, so in that sense, obviously, it's reminiscent of the civil rights movement. But what I like the best is the notion of new parties and new people being brought into the engagement, to the debate of what our democracy should look like. What's practical, what meets our ideals, and what's going to work. So in that sense, I think that it's good that new people are involved. I will say this debate is mostly on the issue of illegal immigration. One small point I want to say is I was surprised to find, and I argue in this book, that the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 is the third great pillar of the landmark of the Civil Rights era in legislation, along with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It passed with just a few weeks after the Voting Rights Act by almost an identical vote. And Johnson said there was no way it could have passed if the Southerners who had defended the race-based quota system that had been in existence for all of the 20th century, basically, that didn't allow most of the rest of the world to become naturalized citizens. And Johnson went up and signed this, and Ted Kennedy was the floor manager as a freshman senator. He shouldn't have been the floor manager, but Johnson made him the floor manager because he said the Kennedy family is involved with immigration issues up in Boston. They've always been involved in that. I'm going to take this kid and give him something that comes out of his heritage and see if he's man enough to pass this bill. And he did. But when he went up he went to the Statue of Liberty and signed this bill and said, "Never more will the gate to freedom be shadowed by the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege." And sure enough, it has transformed America by allowing naturalized citizenship. This is legal immigration, but it was never treated as an issue of much consequence, as a bill of much consequence, let alone as a matter in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution and the spirit of the Civil Rights Movement. It was treated in the New York Times and everywhere else as a Cold War measure to get more anti-Castro Cubans into the country. That's how, we have to have things drummed into us about what the principles at stake are. But I argue that the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, by essentially saying that the whole world is eligible to be citizens, that our idea of citizenship is a commitment to freedom, not a commitment to who's a real kind of American. And that idea is involved in the subtext of the current immigration debate, where a lot of it is, they don't belong here. I don't care whether they got papers or not. Get these people out of my country.
I think that the roots of the cultural roots of the abhorrence of immigrants who are different are almost as deep as the racist roots that the civil rights movement was fighting about. It's astonishing, but it is true that one of the acts of the first Congress of the United States in 1790 was to pass an immigration bill that proclaimed that only white people, only white immigrants, could become citizens of the United States. And there are echoes of that in the contemporary debates. I was on a television panel with a United States senator during the debate on the 1997 immigration bill. His name was Richard Shelby from Alabama. And he said, looking right into the mirror of the television camera with no embarrassment whatsoever, we've got to tighten up this immigration stuff, or in 50 years this country's going to look like India. There was. Flat and raw. And unapologetic. And if you listen to the Minutemen down on the border, talking about sovereignty and control, and they're just echoes of this same old racism that we heard around summer about voting. Same thing, same stuff.
Carol, you had talked about that we're living with political rhetoric that's reactionary. And I guess I'm wondering if the reality of our society isn't starting to match the rhetoric. And I think that's a concern. And sort of looking, for instance, at civil rights enforcement generally. The great laws that were passed during the 1960s. We now have an executive branch that has put people in charge of enforcement of those laws, that the people don't really believe in the laws. We've had an unprecedented number of very conservative judges appointed, many of whom sort of grew up learning to rebel against the decisions of the Warren Court. And in fact, the new Chief Justice and Justice Alito were very open about their rejection of Warren Court precedents, and when they worked in the Department of Justice in the 1980s about their opposition to some of the remedies that had been formulated in civil rights cases, and at least and also against the Voting Rights Act and other great civil rights landmarks. Those men are now at the peak of power, and I wonder what that bodes for our future, for the continuation of the kind of progress that we experienced in civil rights.
I think it's very ominous. But I think that we're out of balance in a number of ways. Somehow I feel that there's an underlying reason why there's so much rancor in today's politics, because somehow we've reduced our spitballs to the notion of liberal and conservative, and conservatives are mad because they've been winning elections for 2 generations, but they find themselves debating civil union versus full gay marriage. How did that happen? The word gay didn't even exist so that in many respects the progressive trends are still going. I mean, in historical terms, what's happened to gay rights is lightning speed forward. I know that's of little comfort to somebody who doesn't have their rights today, but in historical terms, from a time only 40 years ago when I had the top official in the National Council of Churches murdered, and his own family and the top officials of the church aborted the murder investigation because they'd rather not know who killed him than to bring to light evidence that he may have been gay. That's how terrified people were. They couldn't even mention it. So I think that we're in a very strange time now. Liberals don't know how to claim the progress that we've made in the last 40 years, that they're all liberal ideas, and conservatives were against every one of them. Alito was always on the wrong side of history, and yet somehow we say they have the great ideas. Conservatives have won all these elections. They stuff, and they are in danger now, and yet they feel that they can't gain any traction. So I think a lot of that is because people haven't really defined, brought rhetoric and reality together. We have all kinds of inverted forms of reality. I think Martin Luther King, I can get in trouble for this, but I think Martin Luther King could have delivered Bush's second inaugural. You guys, just because Bush gave it, you may, but if you read that thing, it is not a superficial description of freedom as a mission in the world. It's dangerously Wilsonian, perhaps, but it is not superficial. But we live in a world where he talks like Martin Luther King and governs like Caesar. And nobody is trying to draw those contradictions together. That's what I mean about the world being out of sorts. And but we are threatened because we've allowed for a long time people to get along on the mythology that all the new ideas and all these notions of government is bad that have populated the federal government with people who don't believe in the mission of their own agency. This is part of the notion why public services, the reputation of public service has gone into the toilet. Because we've been saying the government is corrupt. We've been cynical in our public attitudes. Cynicism is an appetite, not a judgment. It's an appetite not to want any good things to come out of there. And so you recruit people who don't want good. I can tell you for a fact that the Social Security Administration, where I live in Baltimore, all the executive floors are populated by people who don't believe in the fundamental mission of Social Security. And I don't think it's that different from in lots of other agencies, including FEMA. If you say public service is bad, when you really need it, it won't be there. And I think that's what happened in Katrina, and that's what's happened in a lot. We haven't had a major effort for inclusive schools through the government, using the power of government to expand diversity in the schools now for 30 years. So whatever progress we made, and right now we're making negative progress in most states, was drift. All that we've been able to do was what was set in motion a long time ago. And so we are in peril that we're not pushing forward anymore. What do you think, Ron?
I think that the right has stolen something very valuable from the civil rights movement. We in that movement had an attitude of righteous aggrievement. Because we were citizens and we were limited in our practice of citizenship either by law or by custom, and we were aggrieved, and we had documents, historic documents, to prove that we were aggrieved and we were American citizens. So come on now, let's move it. Well, two things happened. We started getting stuff, but Being Johnson, overreached. Because he wanted to fix everything in his term. And I don't think you can expand government functions as quickly as he tried to do and conduct a terrible war without selling virtually everything that you touched. At the same time, the culture was telling the privileged people a very different story, where we saw an expansion of justice and an expansion of public decency, that is, public service going to people who needed it. They saw an assault on their guaranteed cultural heritage of privilege. Wealth is to be privileged, And whiteness is to be privileged by our culture. And straightness, being straight rather than gay or lesbian. And it aggrieved these people deeply and profoundly. And they felt that their country was being taken away from them. And they were being made to feel that very deeply by very skillful, demagogical people on the right. So now you've got a society in which there's righteous agreement on both sides. I mean, just look at the arguments about abortion. Everybody is righteous, and everybody thinks the other people are unrighteous and profoundly, religiously, spiritually wrong. And for the last 6 years, or whatever, we've had a president who doesn't normally talk the way he did in the second inaugural.
No.
Nor does he act in the way of the second inaugural. So that the overdog's sense of aggrievement is being fed. And the underdog's sense of aggrievement remains and grows. So that's where we are. And we don't have any politicians on either side with a large enough vision and a strong enough intellect and personal capacity to draw people together and to take this heat out of our politics and get us, as Johnson used to say, to reason together. Doesn't happen. And period. I have no answers. That's just...
Why don't we open it up to the audience before they get aggrieved? And we have a microphone, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and Karen will come around to you.
Mr. Branch, I'd like you to just repeat something you said at the beginning of your remarks. You were talking about the Constitutional Convention and the document that came out of it, and you said it was as something as philosophy, and had the ability to enthrall and move us as music. I can't remember the first two parts.
I'm not sure I did either.
We have it on videotape.
Oh, good. Okay.
I was just speaking, but my point was about the Constitution and about the whole system of thinking, which is basically what you as lawyers, I've been trained that you as lawyers appreciate, that the way of thinking there about citizenship, and that we don't appreciate how permanently engaging that ought to be and that it was a new system, that it changed even political theory from vertical to horizontal, and it was an intellectual, political, cultural, spiritual transformation that is ongoing. And what I'm trying to say is that new system of government, what freedom means as an intellectual challenge, is, I think I said it's as broad as philosophy, as deep as religion, and as enthralling as music, but we tend to put it in our pocket and take it for granted. We don't even teach civics in America. And it ought to be something where if you're a citizen and you have a sense that you're responsible for everything that goes on, and that you have a stake in what we've created as citizens, in other words, the horizontal bonds that tie us through law and through contracts and all that, is a lot of what makes the world go round, is the informed, differentiation and consent that we have. That's our real power. Military people understand that better than civilians. Which has been a great paradox for me. I did spend some time during the Clinton administration talking with high military officers. And I was amazed by how sophisticated they are about the relationship between violence and democracy. The rest of us ought to be studying that. Instead, they study it. And what they were saying is that over the last 2 centuries of industrialized warfare, basically since Napoleon and the concept of total war, that military force destroys more and governs less. And that you have to be more skeptical about the political uses of military force. This is military officers saying this. And the rest of the world is just mute, except we say we support our troops.
Where were they in 2003 when we needed them?
There are a lot of them, you know.
Yeah, right. Coming out now.
Mr. Branch, I read excerpts of your book in the Time magazine, and I was impressed by how you put together the timeline that led to Dr. King's assassination. And I was wondering, how long did it take for you to do the research to put that timeline together? And it seemed like it was very painstaking because you had it down to the day and sometimes to the hour and the minute that certain events happened. And I was wondering how what went into your research and how long it took for you to put the timelines together as far as the last few days of the civil rights. I should say the last few days leading up to Dr. King's assassination.
You mean just to write that section?
Well, yeah, because I only read excerpts, and I have to admit I didn't read the book, but I was impressed, and I got a lot out of what I read from the excerpts, and it looked like there was a lot of painstaking research. Looks like I need to buy a book, right?
Well, I started writing this book in 2000, but I spent a lot of time in Selma, so the answer is, when I got right to the end, I probably didn't take more than 3 months to do that. The 2 chapters at the end in Memphis and Requiem, the last 2 chapters, didn't take more than 2-3 months apiece. However, I've been involved in Memphis. When I started this project, I didn't know that it was going to be 3 volumes. I promised that it would be 1 volume. And in fact, the last stop on my first cut of research after a year and a half was Memphis back in 1983. Just a year after I started the book, I felt obliged to go and stay in the Lorraine Motel while I was doing research there for 10 days. And I really profoundly embarrassed myself because I went and the guy asked me how long I wanted to stay, and I said, oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. And he looked thunderstruck, and he said, you mean 4 or 5 hours? And I said, no, 4 or 5 days. He says, well, we don't have any keys. The hooker stole the keys. I completely naive about the sad state of the Lorraine Motel. But that's 22, 23 years ago. Now it's one of the best museums on the face of the earth. If you've been to Memphis and had an occasion to go in that same building. I was so lonely and depressed, I asked for the closest room to 306. They put me in 310. Every time I came back late at night, I had to go knock on the door and rouse somebody to come and let me in because they didn't have any keys. I think I was the only person there, certainly in the morning. And I would go across town to Graceland, and there would be thousands and thousands of people, and the place where Dr. King had been shot, only 16 years ago, was utterly abandoned, very depressed, and all that. So I've been involved with Memphis for a long time. It was there, in fact, that I discovered a citizens movement that preserved cross-racial citizens movement, wonderful, that put together, that said, we don't know what happened here, but let's collect material. And they did. They did oral histories with everybody, and it was an enormous service to history on the part of ordinary citizens. And one of the things they did was that they collected the outtakes from the TV stations. And that was what led me to Vernon Johns. Any of you who have read Parting the Waters, It starts with a chapter on Vernon Johns, who was the answer to what paralyzed me for almost a year, more than 20 years ago. On the one hand, I felt you couldn't start a book about the movement without something about the black church in the South, since the movement came out of it. On the other hand, my biggest rule was all stories, no essays. You can't write an essay on them. So I didn't know how to start the book. And I was there watching these outtakes that the Citizens Committee had gathered of the news shows. And there was this young white reporter trying to interview Ralph Abernathy on the night of the assassination, and he couldn't get Abernathy to say a word. He was just pleading with him. You know, what happened? Did you see the shot? Did you know he was dead? Did you say anything? Did he say anything? Abernathy didn't say anything. I think he was in shock. He wasn't paying any attention to him. I identified with this guy because I had interviewed Abernathy by then and had a similar...
I think it works without it.
Oh, yeah. Does that work?
Yeah.
Anyway, the guy finally gave up and said, well, if you can't say what happened tonight, can you tell me when you first met Dr. King? And Abernathy was like he came out of a trance. He said, I first met Dr. King when he arrived at my parsonage on a cold, rainy January morning in the company of Vernon Johns, the light of my life, and we ate the prophet's dinner. And he started telling stories about Vernon Johns. He said, I sold ladies' lingerie on the streets of Montgomery for Vernon Johns, and that shows how much I love that man, because that was embarrassing. And so he started telling Vernon Johns stories. And to me, there in Memphis, it was a indication of the power of Vernon Johns if Abernathy in that moment would tell Vernon Johns stories. And so the next time I went to see Abernathy, I had a whole treasure trove of Vernon Johns questions, and it was like putting a key in the ignition. Changed my whole relationship with him and provided the answer to how, to the question. All that came out of Memphis. So I've been involved in Memphis in a lot of different ways for a long time. The thing that people told me the very first time that I went there is don't forget the two guys who were killed, the two trash men, who were crushed in the back of the garbage van because the rules of the day and the mayor did not allow black sanitation workers to seek shelter in rainstorms because they had too many complaints from white citizens who thought that the garbage workers looked like they were having a picnic on their lawns. So they had a rule that garbage workers had even in a downpour, a torrential downpour, they could not seek shelter. Everybody said that this was, if you want to know where I am a man came from, the slogans that they were walking, this is where this came from, because on this day, just before the sanitation workers' strike started, they had a terrible downspour. It was the day that Lisa Marie Presley was born. Elvis was going through the same rainstorm, but getting a lot more press coverage. And they couldn't all fit in the cab of the garbage truck.
Not Elvis. Not Elvis.
All the garbage workers. There were 4 garbage workers and a driver, and all 4 of the workers couldn't fit. And normally they rode on the outside in the rain, but the rain was so bad that they crawled into the back, and they tripped over the lever that compacted them, and they were compacted in the back of the garbage with the garbage and killed. And the city refused to pay for their funerals, refused any, because they were not civil service workers, and they were buried in northern Mississippi. And this was the catalyst for the sanitation workers' strike. And people around the movement there in Memphis told me that this is what Dr. King would talk about a lot, why this was a perfect, even though he didn't want to go to Memphis, it was a diversion from the Poor People's Campaign. It so epitomized the invisibility of poor people that he was trying to make a reality that he had to go to Memphis. So I had a lot of emotional force about Memphis that was built up over the years of doing research there, but to answer your question, the actual composition of those final few few weeks of his life in those final few days only took me a matter of weeks.
Let me say one additional thing about that. At the time of Martin King's death, I was a Justice Department official dealing with civil rights. And one of the things that we did was to sift through threats on his life that we thought, well, we sift through piles of threats because there were just lots and lots of threats, but to pick out those few that really looked like they might be real and might be dangerous. And I was working fairly close with King at that time because I was the federal official who was in charge of receiving the For People's Campaign when it ultimately got here. So after there was violence in one demonstration in Memphis, King went back to Atlanta. I talked to him and I told him that we had some stuff, one thing that looked pretty bad, couldn't tell, but, and it had to do with Memphis. And then I said, look like those people aren't really organized over there. He said, well, that's right. And I said, well, that's dangerous. And he said, well, that's right. And I said, well, don't go back. He said, I have to. I said, why do you have to go back? And he told me the story, which somehow I'd missed in the newspaper about these guys being crushed. And then he said, so I've got to go back because I promised them I would come. Last conversation I ever had with him.
I didn't know that.
Thank you. I was interested in your comments on the admixture of religion and politics in the use by Dr. King. Could you comment on the religious right and their use of religion in politics today?
Yes, they talk about sex and not about violence. They use religion as a way of using fear to rule rather than overcoming fear, which is the democratic summons and the spiritual summons. You know, all government is about what do we do with our fears, and democracy summons us to face them together in an open and accountable way, and to build public trust in self-government. And demagoguery says use the fear to rule. And, you know, that was the genius of J. Edgar Hoover, to market the FBI as what stood between America and what Americans feared most from immigrants. He started in the immigrant period in World War I, all the way through you know, the gangsters and the Nazis and the communists and finally the terrible black radicals. You know, I don't really want to denigrate anybody else's notion of religion. I don't think that that's a healthy thing to do. But I think that it's much better to draw people out as to what their spiritual imperatives are, because there are times when I sense that some of the people speaking for religion don't have a spiritual bone in their body. And the problem is that people on the other side tend to attack religion. And it's very hard to win in American politics with a purely secularist, anti-religious appeal. And I think people make a mistake. In fact, my historical rule is that progressive movements never win unless they combine the voices of prophetic justice with the sensibilities of women. And that's been true throughout American history, even in the revolutionary period, but certainly the abolitionist phase all the way through the civil rights movement. And, that's one of the reasons the abortion movement has been such a big watershed, because it tended to put female sensibilities against religious voices and allow people who had been on their heels morally, the segregationists, to come forward, go on the moral aggrievement. Jerry Falwell was an entrepreneurial segregationist until he seized on the abortion issue and proclaimed himself the moral majority. So what you don't sense coming out of those people is the inspiration of religion and the Bible most frequently talks. There are more injunctions by a power of 4 about dealing with poverty and measuring justice by widows and orphans, which is the great original insight of prophetic justice, than any other injunction in the Bible. So if you're not talking about poverty and you're not talking about overcoming violence, you're not really likely clinging to the discipline of the Spirit. And that's close to the discipline of democracy. And so we ought to be able to keep that kind of interchange on a better track than it's been with people who can sell it as both a democratic and a spiritual calling to have war and tax cuts, as the essence of their faith.
We're pretty much out of time, but before we close, I just wanted to ask each of you if you could quickly give an anecdote, tell a quick story that sort of brings Dr. King to life to wrap it up for us. Roger, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I'll tell a story that Taylor tells in this book. There are a lot of people today who say, I was with Martin Luther King, they were black, I was for Martin, and they are so full of it. I mean, he was one of the most hated men in America. And even people, good white liberals, said, he's gone too far. And there were people who thought he was making money off of what he was doing. There were civil rights people, even big-time civil rights leaders, who were jealous of him, said he was just a headline hunter. And so there was a riot in Chicago in 1966. King had gone to Chicago as the beginning of a push on northern racism, institutionalized racism. And he hadn't really got much started when this riot broke out. So the president sent 2 of us from the Justice Department out to Chicago to do something about the riot. And the other guy was a legendary Civil Rights Division head named John Doerr. And so John and I got there, and if somebody tells you to go out and there's a riot in a city and you 2 guys go and do something, what the heck are you going to do? I mean, to most people you say, you're crazy, but this is the president, you say, yes, sir. Go. So we said, well, we both knew King, and we said, let's go see him and see what he says. Well, liberal friends of mine, when he had said he was going to live in the ghetto, said, yeah, right, it's going to be the only gold-plated ghetto apartment in all of Chicago. And besides, he's there with all the money puffing out of his pockets. So we call him, and he says, don't come now because I've got something going on in the early evening, but come around midnight. So we go, and I'm telling you, this was a ratty building. Figuratively and literally. And you walked into the lobby, just open the front door and you go into the entryway, and it just began to smell of urine. There was all kind of dirt on the floor, and the walls, paint was peeling on the walls. And it was hot in Chicago that day. And it was hot and close there. Well, it turned out Martin lived on the top floor. So the higher you go, the stinkier, it was just terrible. And you go up to the top floor, and you knock on the door, and now the heat of the day is still coming through the roof, so it is really hot. You knock on the door, and somebody starts to open the door, but the door won't open. And so there was a lot of pushing. Finally, we could see the guy on the inside pulling the door was Andy Young, one of his top aides. And the reason we couldn't get in was because there was humanity throughout this whole room. And so when we got in and we were squeezed over to the side, we realized there were young people. And they took off every nook and cranny. And Martin just paused and said, these are some men from the White House. I'll see them later. And he said, hi, John, hi, Roger. And then he went back to these people. And I soon realized what he was doing was he was carrying on a nonviolent seminar with these people. And I finally realized who these people were. They were the most despised black people in the country. They were Chicago gang members. And the Illinois National Guard had come into town that night with tanks and jeeps with loaded machine guns, and they wanted to go out and protect their turf. They wanted to go out and throw rocks and Molotov cocktails and get those guys. And King was sitting there. There wasn't a journalist in the room. There wasn't a camera in the room. King put this meeting together long before he knew we were in town. We see now the naked king. And what is this guy doing? This famous Nobel Prize winner. He's sitting there preaching nonviolence to these kids and saving their lives. Kids who the rest of society hates. And it didn't matter how many times he had to answer a question. And he was patient, and he was generous, and he was thoughtful, and he didn't let them go. We got there about midnight. And Taylor said, his memory is better than mine. I told him, I think it was 4 hours. So we got there at midnight. He let them go when from each kid he had received a pledge of nonviolent behavior. The kid was going home, and then he was going to come back and do some things with King and his operation the next day. Only then did he let them go. And then he said, okay, fellas, let's go in back and talk. And it was a shotgun apartment. And he knocked on one door, and he said, Corey, John and Roger here, and we're going to go have some coffee. You want to join us? And so Mrs. King put on a robe, and she came out. And Andy came in, and we sat there at that kitchen table in that ratty place, and we talked about Chicago, the riots, race, Chicago politics, and what we could do to make it better. That was the Martin King I will always remember.
Well, I'd like to go back just a little before that, because I think that story shows him, but it also is a hint. You add a huge dose of Vietnam with 100 Americans a week getting killed. You get some notion of how poisoned the whole culture was by violence very quickly after the zenith of the civil rights movement at Selma. But getting to Selma, I told you that Diane Nash, this young girl from Chicago, a Catholic beauty queen who could pass for white, wrote the blueprint for the Selma March and drove into Birmingham on the morning after the Birmingham church bombing, when people were milling around, threatening to riot, pushed her way in and said, here, read this. You can read this document now. It's the blueprint for saying, basically it said, if black people could vote in Alabama, you wouldn't have crimes like the Birmingham church bombing, because people would know they wouldn't be sloughed off. And this is a model for how to paralyze Alabama with a nonviolent army until it grants black people the vote, right to vote. And she literally shoves her way through and says, here, take this out there and talk to those people, because when you have people who have legitimate grievances and are willing to die, you have to give them direction and leadership. You can't just tell them, go to the funeral and go home. And Dr. King says to Diane, Diane, I understand that, and this is important, but we have been agitating for 10 years to end segregation. We finally got the Civil Rights Bill before Congress. We can't say, well, we changed our mind, let's put that on hold for a while. I want to work on the right to vote. And so Diane basically got pushed aside, and Dr. King came up to see President Kennedy. That's September 1963. But Andy and everybody else said that Diane pestered him. Bevel told me, James Bevel is Diane's wife, the most, husband, I'm sorry. They were husband and wife. The most unlikely couple you will ever see, because he was a rascal. Dr. King said of him, he heard voices, people told him what to do, he had mysterious revelations, he tormented Diane, he ran around on her, he called her an ice queen, but he also had a prophetic genius about him. Dr. King said it's the cracked ones that let the light in. So Bevel and Diane had proposed this plan to answer the Birmingham church bombing and pestered him all through the year 1964 when the Civil Rights Bill was pending. And Bevel once told me that he went to see the movie African Queen with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, and that not until he saw Bogart down in the river jumping around with the leeches on him did he have an image for how Diane could get on people. He said, that's the way she would get on you, and she had gotten on him about a number of things, and he said, she stayed on Dr. King, and then when the Civil Rights Bill passed in the summer of 1964, she said, now, let's do this. And they went to the Nobel Peace Prize in the fall of 1964 at a moment of great personal crisis for Dr. King, because that's when the blackmail, Hoover had called him the most notorious liar, they'd sent him the tapes, it was ugly and nasty. And he went to receive the Nobel Prize. And Andy and all of the staff people said basically that they, having passed the Civil Rights Bill, wanted to dine out on it for about 20 years before they did anything risky again. They wanted to have awards and honorary degrees and chicken dinners, and we ended segregation, and that's it. And Dr. King gives this Nobel Prize address, the most underrated document of his whole career, saying that nonviolence is at the core of the promise for democracy, not just to attack racism, but to attack the triple associated scourges of poverty, racism, and war, violence of the flesh, violence of the spirit that undermines the capacity of the human family to govern themselves. He gives this incredible speech and says, we're going to Selma, because he had promised Diane and Bevel that he would. And when he gets back, they wanted to postpone it 20 years, but if not 20 years, 1 year. And he says, no, we are at the mountaintop. This is a glorious moment, but the valley calls me. And the valley is Diane, and the valley is Bevel. But most of all, it's the combination of a tremendous citizen's conscience and a tremendous vision of the power of our common heritage to deal with all of those scourges. And that's what drove him. That's what I call the downward king, from the glory moment of the Nobel Prize and ending civil rights, which is more than enough for one person's lifetime, and he's only in his mid-30s then. From there through Chicago with the gang members and down finally with the garbage workers in Memphis. King was propelled by a kind of a downward impulse to go back and bring along the people who've been left behind. And that is noble calling in a nutshell.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. please join us for some refreshments. And I believe there are books out back, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.